2 weeks had passed since the confrontation in her father's study, and Charlotte had settled into a careful routine of appearing completely normal while secretly monitoring every development in the investigation. She attended her scheduled royal engagements, participated in family dinners with perfect composure, and maintained friendly conversations with palace staff as if nothing had changed. But beneath the surface, she was gathering intelligence and preparing for the next phase of what had become a deadly game of survival. Her efforts had paid off in unexpected ways. Through careful observation and strategic conversations, Charlotte had learned that Captain Voss had indeed received her warning and had taken immediate action. The northern provinces had quietly reinforced their defenses, established emergency food reserves, and created secure communication networks that would allow villages to support each other if trade routes were disrupted. Her message had prevented a humanitarian crisis, but it had also created a new problem. Alexander and Lord Pemberton had been forced to delay their cruel policies because the northern communities were now too well prepared to be easily victimized. This had made them even more determined to identify and punish whoever had interfered with their plans. The investigation had intensified, with new questions being asked and new pressure being applied to anyone who might have information about the security breach. Charlotte was reviewing correspondence from her charitable organizations when her lady-in-waiting, Elena, knocked softly on her door. Elena had served Charlotte faithfully for 3 years and had become more friend than servant, one of the few people in the palace Charlotte trusted completely. "Your Highness, there's been an unusual development," Elena said quietly, closing the door behind her and moving close to Charlotte's desk. "I thought you should know immediately." Charlotte set down her papers, recognizing the tone that meant Elena had important information. "What's happened?" "A messenger arrived this morning from the northern provinces. He didn't come through normal official channels, and he specifically requested to speak with you privately. He's been waiting in the servants' quarters for hours, refusing to leave until he can deliver his message personally." Charlotte's pulse quickened. A messenger from the north who wanted to speak with her directly could only mean one thing. Captain Voss was trying to communicate with her, but the risk of meeting with him was enormous. If anyone discovered that she was receiving secret messages from the northern provinces, it would provide the evidence her family needed to prove her guilt. "Did he say anything about what his message concerns?" Charlotte asked. "Only that it involves matters of mutual concern regarding the welfare of northern communities," Elena replied. "He seems like a reliable person, but he's clearly nervous about being here." Charlotte weighed her options quickly. She needed to know what Captain Voss wanted to communicate, but she couldn't risk a direct meeting that might be observed or reported. Then, an idea formed in her mind, a way to receive the message while maintaining plausible denial about its contents. "Elena, I need you to do something for me that might be dangerous," Charlotte said carefully. "I understand if you prefer not to be involved." Elena straightened her shoulders, her expression showing determination rather than fear. "Whatever you need, Your Highness. I've seen how you've been these past weeks, and I know you're trying to do something important." Charlotte felt a rush of gratitude for her loyal friend. "I want you to meet with this messenger as if you're acting on your own initiative. Tell him that you've noticed my concern for the northern provinces and that you wanted to learn more about conditions there so you could provide me with better information for my charitable work. Let him give you whatever message he has, but make it clear that you're doing this independently, not on my direct orders." Elena nodded, understanding immediately. "If anyone questions me later, I can truthfully say that I sought out the information myself because I wanted to help with your charitable efforts." "Exactly. And, Elena, if the message contains anything that seems dangerous or controversial, I want you to forget you ever heard it. I won't ask you to carry secrets that could put you at risk." Elena smiled. "I appreciate your concern for me, Your Highness, but I've already chosen my side in whatever is happening here. Let me get the message, and we can decide together what to do with it." After Elena left, Charlotte tried to return to her correspondence, but concentration was impossible. Everything depended on what Captain Voss wanted to communicate. Was he warning her about new developments in the investigation? Had her family discovered his role in protecting the northern communities? Or was he reaching out with information that could help her understand the larger scope of Alexander and Lord Pemberton's plans? An hour later, Elena returned with news that exceeded Charlotte's worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. Captain Voss's message revealed that the crisis in the northern provinces was part of a much larger conspiracy involving several regional commanders and powerful nobles throughout the kingdom. He says that Lord Pemberton has been organizing a network of supporters who believe the common people have become too independent and need to be reminded of their proper place, Elena reported quietly. They're planning similar actions in multiple regions, using different methods but with the same goal of breaking community resistance to increased taxation and expanded royal authority. Charlotte felt her blood turn to ice. What she had witnessed was not an isolated policy discussion, but evidence of a systematic campaign to crush popular resistance across the entire kingdom. Alexander and their father might not even be the primary architects of these plans. They might be following a strategy developed by Lord Pemberton and his allies. There's more, Elena continued. Captain Voss says there are other military commanders who are uncomfortable with these plans, but who are afraid to speak out because they don't know who they can trust. He thinks there might be enough decent people in positions of authority to resist these policies if they could find a way to coordinate their efforts safely. Charlotte realized that she was facing a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could continue trying to protect individual communities from specific threats, operating in secret, and hoping to avoid detection. Or she could take the enormous risk of trying to organize broader resistance to what was becoming clear was a kingdom-wide conspiracy against the common people. The decision was made easier by what Elena told her next. Captain Voss also sent this, Elena said, producing a small piece of parchment from her sleeve. He said you should read it privately and destroy it immediately. Charlotte unfolded the message, recognizing Captain Voss's careful handwriting. Your Highness, the children in Thornwick Village send their gratitude for the supplies that reached them before the planned shortages could take effect. Little Maria asked me to tell you that her father is working again because the advance warning gave him time to secure contracts with merchants in neighboring regions. You have saved more lives than you know, but the danger is far from over. If you are willing to continue this work, there are others who would stand with you. If not, please know that your courage has already made a difference that will be remembered. A faithful servant of all the realm's people. Tears blurred Charlotte's vision as she read about Maria and her family. The 7-year-old girl she had met during her visit was safe because of the warning she had sent, and that knowledge strengthened her resolve more than any consideration of personal safety ever could. Charlotte looked up at Elena, who was watching her with obvious concern. Elena, if I asked you to help me do something that could change the entire kingdom but might cost us both our lives, what would you say? Elena didn't hesitate. I would say that some things are worth any risk, Your Highness, and I would ask what you need me to do. Charlotte moved to her fireplace and held Captain Voss's message over the flames, watching as it curled into ash. As the evidence of their communication disappeared, she felt her old life burning away with it. Princess Charlotte, the dutiful daughter who trusted her family and accepted her place in the established order, was gone forever. We're going to send another message, Charlotte said, turning back to Elena. But this time, we're not just warning one captain about one set of plans. We're going to reach out to every decent person in a position of authority throughout this kingdom and give them a chance to stand together against what Lord Pemberton and his allies are planning. Elena nodded, her expression showing both excitement and determination. How do we do that without getting caught? Charlotte moved to her writing desk and began pulling out maps of the kingdom, lists of military commanders, and records of regional administrators. Very carefully, and with a lot of help from people who understand that protecting the realm means protecting its people, not just its rulers. Over the next several hours, Charlotte and Elena developed a plan that was both audacious and carefully calculated. They would use Charlotte's extensive knowledge of palace operations and her connections throughout the kingdom to identify trustworthy officials who might be willing to resist Lord Pemberton's conspiracy. They would create a secure communication network that could coordinate defensive efforts across multiple regions. And they would gather evidence of the conspiracy that could eventually be used to expose the truth to King Edward and others who might not be aware of the full scope of what was being planned in their names. As dawn approached, Charlotte stood at her window looking out over the kingdom she was pledging to protect in ways her royal birth had never envisioned. She was about to become something the palace had never seen, a princess who served the people rather than ruling over them, a member of the royal family who placed justice above loyalty to her own bloodline. The risks were enormous. Discovery would mean charges of treason, exile, or worse. Success would mean fundamental changes to how power was exercised throughout the kingdom, changes that would threaten the interests of many powerful people who would not surrender their advantages easily. But, as Charlotte thought about Maria and all the other children whose futures depended on whether decent people were willing to fight for justice, the choice became simple. She had been born into privilege and power, and she could use those advantages to serve the common good or to perpetuate systems that caused unnecessary suffering. Charlotte turned from the window and began drafting the first of many messages that would soon carry hope and coordination to good people throughout the kingdom. She was no longer just Princess Charlotte of Valdoria. She had become something far more dangerous to those who would abuse their power, and far more valuable to those who needed protection from such abuse. She was now a leader of the resistance, and the real fight for the soul of the kingdom was about to begin. The morning sun illuminated her face as she worked, writing words that would either transform her realm or cost her everything she had ever known. But, for the first time since that terrible night in the library, Charlotte felt truly at peace with her choices. She was finally using her royal status for its highest purpose, serving justice rather than simply maintaining power. In the northern provinces, Captain Voss would soon receive a message that would change everything. And, throughout the kingdom, other decent people in positions of authority would have to choose whether to stand with a princess who had chosen the people over the palace, or to serve a system that valued obedience over justice. Charlotte sealed her first message and prepared to discover who else in her kingdom truly understood what it meant to serve the realm. 3 days had passed since Charlotte sent her warning to Captain Voss, and the palace atmosphere had grown increasingly tense. She moved through her daily routines with practiced composure, attending formal dinners, participating in charitable committee meetings, and maintaining her public schedule as if nothing had changed. But, beneath her calm exterior, anxiety gnawed at her constantly. She had received no word about whether her message had reached its destination, and the uncertainty was torturous. Every time a messenger arrived at the palace, Charlotte's heart would leap, wondering if it carried news from the northern provinces. Every time her father or Alexander received official correspondence, she studied their faces for any sign that their plans had been discovered or disrupted. On the morning of the fourth day, Charlotte's worst fears seemed to be materializing. Lord Pemberton arrived for an unscheduled meeting with her father, his usually composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. She watched from her window as his carriage pulled up to the palace entrance, noting how he hurried up the steps without his typical measured pace. Within an hour, Charlotte was summoned to her father's private study. King Edward sat behind his massive oak desk, his weathered hands folded in front of him, and his steel-gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her stomach churn. Alexander stood near the fireplace, his expression unreadable, but his posture rigid with tension. Lord Pemberton occupied a chair near the window, his lips pressed into a thin line of displeasure. "Charlotte, my dear," King Edward began, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for official business rather than the warmth she usually heard in private family conversations. "We need to discuss a matter of considerable importance." Charlotte forced herself to meet her father's gaze directly, drawing on years of royal training that had taught her to project confidence even when she felt terrified. "Of course, father. How can I help?" "There has been an unfortunate breach of security regarding sensitive palace communications," Lord Pemberton interjected, his voice sharp with accusation. "Someone has been interfering with official state business in ways that could endanger the stability of the kingdom." Charlotte's hands remained steady in her lap, but her mind raced. Had they discovered her message? How much did they know? She needed to be extremely careful about how she responded. "I don't understand," she said, allowing a note of confusion to color her voice. "What sort of interference?" Alexander stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's face. "Someone sent an unauthorized warning to military personnel in the northern provinces. a warning that contained remarkably detailed information about confidential policy discussions. The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Charlotte could feel all three men studying her reaction, searching for any sign of guilt or deception. She had prepared for this moment, knowing it might come, but the reality of facing her family's suspicion still felt like a physical blow. "That sounds very serious," Charlotte said carefully. "Do we know who might have access to such information?" "That's precisely what we're trying to determine," King Edward replied. "The message was sent from the palace communications room 3 nights ago, during the evening hours when the duty officer was briefly absent. Very few people would have both access to that area and knowledge of the information that was leaked." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the problem from a purely analytical perspective. "Have you questioned the communications staff? Perhaps someone overheard conversations they weren't meant to hear." "We have conducted thorough interviews with all relevant personnel," Lord Pemberton said coldly. "The duty officer has been questioned extensively and has provided a complete account of his activities that evening. He recalls stepping away for exactly 7 minutes to address an issue with the signal fire mechanism on the roof. During that time, someone entered his station and used official palace resources to send unauthorized communications. The precision of their investigation was more thorough than Charlotte had hoped, but she maintained her composure. 7 minutes seems like very little time to compose and send a detailed message. Whoever did this must have planned their actions carefully." "Indeed," Alexander said, and Charlotte detected something dangerous in his tone. "This wasn't a spontaneous act of conscience. Someone has been monitoring our private discussions and actively working to undermine royal policy." Charlotte felt a chill run down her spine at her brother's words. The way he emphasized act of conscience suggested he understood exactly what had motivated the leak, which meant he was closer to identifying her as the culprit than she had realized. "What kind of information was in this warning?" Charlotte asked, genuinely curious about how much Captain Voss had learned from her message. "Details about security adjustments in the northern provinces," King Edward replied vaguely. "Policy changes that were being considered for implementation in the coming weeks." Charlotte noticed that her father's description was carefully sanitized, stripping away any mention of the deliberately harmful nature of the plans Alexander and Lord Pemberton had discussed. Even now, facing the potential exposure of their schemes, they were maintaining the fiction that their actions were legitimate governance rather than calculated cruelty. "I hope this breach hasn't created any real problems," Charlotte said. "The northern provinces have been through enough hardship recently." The moment the words left her mouth, Charlotte realized she had made a mistake. Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly, and Lord Pemberton leaned forward in his chair. "What do you know about conditions in the northern provinces?" Alexander asked, his voice deceptively casual. Charlotte's mind scrambled for a safe response. Her recent visit to the region was a matter of public record, but she needed to be careful not to reveal how deeply she had connected with the local population or how much she understood about their struggles. "I conducted royal visits there last month as part of my charitable duties," she said. "I met with local families and community leaders to assess needs for the royal assistance programs. The people seem to be working very hard to manage the challenges they're facing." "And what sorts of challenges would those be?" Lord Pemberton pressed. Charlotte realized she was walking into increasingly dangerous territory, but she couldn't back down without appearing suspicious. The usual concerns of rural communities: ensuring adequate food supplies, maintaining trade relationships, supporting local businesses. Nothing that seemed beyond the normal scope of regional governance. King Edward watched his daughter carefully as she spoke, and Charlotte could see him weighing her words against what he knew about the leaked information. "During your visits, did you speak with anyone who expressed concerns about royal policy? Anyone who might have contacts with military personnel in the region?" The question was clearly a trap, designed to see if Charlotte would reveal connections that could explain how sensitive information had reached Captain Voss. Charlotte knew she needed to respond truthfully enough to avoid being caught in an obvious lie, while still protecting herself and the people she had met. "I spoke with many people during my visits," she said. "It's natural for citizens to discuss their concerns with royal family members when they have the opportunity. Most of their questions were about assistance programs and local development projects. I don't recall anyone specifically mentioning military personnel," though I suppose some of the community leaders might have regular contact with the guard units stationed in their areas. Did you meet with Captain Henrik Voss during your visit? Alexander asked suddenly. Charlotte's heart lurched, but she managed to maintain her composure. I believe I was introduced to several military officers during formal ceremonies. The names and specific conversations blur together during busy official visits. It was a carefully crafted non-answer that acknowledged the possibility of meeting Captain Voss without confirming specific interactions or conversations. Charlotte hoped it would be enough to deflect suspicion without creating obvious contradictions if they investigated further. This investigation is far from over, Lord Pemberton announced, rising from his chair. Whoever is responsible for this breach has committed an act of treason against the Crown. When we identify them, they will face the full consequences of their actions. The threat was clearly directed at Charlotte, though it was phrased as a general statement. She met Lord Pemberton's gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated by his obvious attempt to frighten her into a confession. I hope you find the person responsible quickly, Charlotte said. The security of palace communications is essential for effective governance. King Edward nodded slowly, but Charlotte could see that he remained troubled by the situation. You may go, Charlotte, but I want you to think carefully about anything you might have observed that could help our investigation. Sometimes people notice things without realizing their significance. Charlotte rose gracefully from her chair, offering a respectful curtsy to her father. Of course, father. If I remember anything that might be helpful, I'll inform you immediately. As she reached the door, Alexander's voice stopped her. Charlotte, it might be wise for you to limit your interactions with palace staff for the time being. Until this matter is resolved, we need to be very careful about who has access to sensitive information. The suggestion was clearly an attempt to restrict her movement and monitor her activities more closely. Charlotte turned back to face her brother, offering him a smile that felt like broken glass in her mouth. I understand completely. The security of the realm must always be our highest priority. Once outside her father's study, Charlotte walked calmly to her chambers, maintaining perfect composure until she reached the safety of her private rooms. Only then did she allow herself to collapse into a chair, her hands shaking as the full weight of her situation settled over her. They suspected her, but they didn't have proof. The investigation was clearly focusing on palace personnel with access to sensitive information, and her status as a family member gave her both vulnerability and protection. They couldn't openly accuse her without solid evidence, but they were clearly watching her closely for any sign of guilt. Charlotte realized she needed to be even more careful now. Any suspicious behavior, any deviation from her normal routines, any hint that she was monitoring their activities could provide the evidence they needed to formally charge her with treason. The stakes had risen dramatically, and she was now playing a much more dangerous game. But even as fear settled in her stomach like a cold stone, Charlotte knew she couldn't regret her actions. Somewhere in the northern provinces, Captain Voss had received her warning and was taking steps to protect innocent families from the suffering Alexander and Lord Pemberton had planned. Whatever consequences she might face for her choice to act, she had prevented real harm to real people. As evening approached, Charlotte prepared for what she knew would be many sleepless nights ahead. The investigation would continue, the pressure would intensify, and she would need every ounce of strength and cunning to survive what was coming while continuing to protect those who needed her help. She was no longer just fighting for her own safety. She was fighting for her soul, for her understanding of what it meant to serve her people rather than simply ruling over them. And that was a fight she intended to win, regardless of the cost. Charlotte pressed her back against the cold marble wall, her heart hammering so violently she was certain it could be heard echoing through the palace corridors. The ornate, gold-framed mirror across from her reflected a face she barely recognized, pale, wide-eyed, trembling. Just moments ago, she had been Princess Charlotte of Valdoria, the beloved younger sister of Crown Prince Alexander, known throughout the kingdom for her charitable work and gentle nature. Now she felt like a frightened child who had stumbled into a nightmare. The heavy curtains in the royal library still swayed slightly from where she had hidden behind them, listening to a conversation that would change everything she thought she knew about her family. Her brother's voice had been calm, measured, as he spoke to their father's most trusted advisor, Lord Pemberton. But his words had been anything but reassuring. The villages in the northern provinces need to understand their place, Alexander had said, his tone carrying none of the warmth Charlotte had always associated with her beloved older brother. If they continue to resist the new taxation policies, we may need to consider more direct measures. Lord Pemberton had nodded approvingly. The people have grown too comfortable, Your Highness. They forget that their prosperity exists only through the crown's generosity. Perhaps it is time they were reminded of the consequences of ingratitude. Charlotte had gripped the velvet curtains tighter, her knuckles white. She knew about the northern provinces. She had visited them just last month as part of her royal duties, meeting with families who were already struggling to put food on their tables. The new taxes her father had imposed were crushing these communities, forcing children to work in dangerous conditions just to help their families survive. What sort of direct measures? Alexander had asked, and Charlotte could hear the smile in his voice. It was a smile she had seen countless times during their childhood, usually right before he pulled some cruel prank on the palace servants or found a way to get her into trouble. Food restrictions, perhaps, Pemberton had suggested casually, as if discussing the weather. Or we could withdraw the royal guard protection from their trade routes. Bandits have been quite active lately, and it would be such a shame if merchant convoys were to meet with unfortunate accidents. The conversation had continued for another 20 minutes, each word driving deeper into Charlotte's heart like shards of ice. They spoke of deliberate starvation tactics, of manufacturing crises that would force the northern people into complete submission. They discussed which village leaders might need to be made examples of, their fates delivered with surgical precision to ensure maximum psychological impact on the remaining population. When they finally left the library, Charlotte had waited another 10 minutes before emerging from her hiding spot, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk. She had stumbled through the palace corridors, her mind reeling as she tried to process what she had learned. The brother she had loved and admired her entire life was planning to orchestrate suffering on an unimaginable scale. Now, standing alone in the East Wing corridor, Charlotte faced an impossible choice. Everything she had been taught about loyalty, about family, about her duty as a member of the royal house, told her to remain silent. But everything in her heart screamed that she could not let innocent people suffer when she had the power to prevent it. She thought about little Maria, a 7-year-old girl she had met in the village of Thornwick during her last visit. Maria's father was a blacksmith whose business was already failing under the weight of the existing taxes. Her mother took in washing to make ends meet, working her fingers raw every day just to afford bread for her family. If Alexander's plans came to pass, families like Maria's would face starvation or worse. Charlotte closed her eyes and made her decision. She moved swiftly through the palace corridors, her silk slippers silent against the polished stone floors. The palace guards nodded respectfully as she passed, their familiarity with her presence working in her favor. No one questioned why Princess Charlotte might be walking purposefully through the halls at this hour. She was known for her restless energy and her habit of wandering the palace when troubled. The communications room was located in the North Tower, a secure area where royal messages were sent throughout the kingdom via an advanced system of signal fires and mounted messengers. Charlotte had visited this room many times as a child, fascinated by the complex network that allowed her family to communicate across vast distances in mere hours. Tonight, that network would serve a different purpose. She slipped inside the communications room, grateful to find it temporarily empty. The duty officer had stepped away, leaving behind a half-finished meal and several official documents spread across his desk. Charlotte moved quickly to the message station, her hands shaking as she grabbed parchment and ink. Her mind raced as she composed her warning. She needed to be specific enough to be credible, but vague enough to protect herself if the message was intercepted. Most importantly, she needed to reach someone who could act on the information she was providing. Captain Henrik Voss commanded the Royal Guard unit stationed in the northern provinces. Charlotte had met him during her recent visit and had been impressed by his genuine concern for the local population. Unlike many of the palace guards who saw their postings as tedious duties to endure, Captain Voss seemed to understand that protecting the realm meant protecting all of its people, not just the nobility. She wrote quickly, her normally elegant handwriting becoming rushed and urgent. Captain Voss, plans have been made that will bring great suffering to the northern villages within the fortnight. Food restrictions and withdrawal of trade route protection are being discussed at the highest levels. The village leaders in Thornwick, Millhaven, and Greystone are in particular danger. Trust no official communications regarding policy changes in your region until you can verify their authenticity through multiple sources. A friend who wishes only to prevent unnecessary suffering. She signed it with a small symbol she had seen Captain Voss use during their meeting. A simple drawing of a mountain peak that represented his family's coat of arms. It would serve as proof that the message came from someone who had been in his presence, lending credibility to her warning without revealing her identity. Charlotte sealed the message quickly and placed it in the urgent dispatch pile, marking it for immediate transmission to the northern provinces. The system would ensure it reached Captain Voss within hours, giving him time to prepare defenses for the communities under his protection. As she turned to leave, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Charlotte's blood turned to ice as she recognized the measured pace of palace guards making their rounds. If they found her here, how would she explain her presence in the communications room? The duty officer would return soon and might notice that someone had been at his station. She moved toward the window, desperate for an escape route, when the footsteps passed by without stopping. Charlotte exhaled slowly, realizing she had been holding her breath. She needed to leave immediately, but she also needed to cover her tracks. Thinking quickly, she moved some of the duty officer's papers around slightly, making it appear that he had simply stepped away in the middle of organizing his work. She carefully repositioned his chair and moved his meal to suggest he had been called away suddenly while eating. With any luck, he would assume he had placed the message in the dispatch pile himself during his hurried departure. Charlotte slipped out of the communications room and made her way back through the palace corridors, her heart still racing but her step more confident now. She had done what she could to protect innocent people. The message was on its way, and Captain Voss would have the information he needed to prepare for whatever Alexander and Lord Pemberton had planned. But even as she felt a measure of relief, Charlotte knew that sending the warning was only the beginning. Alexander's plans represented something much larger and more dangerous than a single policy disagreement. Her brother's casual discussion of causing deliberate suffering revealed a darkness in him that she had never suspected, a willingness to use their family's power in ways that went against everything she believed about leadership and responsibility. As she reached her chambers, Charlotte realized that her life had fundamentally changed in the space of a single evening. She could never again look at her brother the same way, could never again trust that the decisions being made in the palace's halls of power were guided by compassion or justice. She was no longer simply Princess Charlotte, devoted sister and dutiful daughter. She had become something else entirely, a guardian of secrets, a protector of the innocent, and, perhaps most dangerously of all, a threat to her own family's plans. She settled into her chair by the window, staring out at the kingdom that stretched beyond the palace walls. Somewhere in the northern provinces, families were sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger that had been planned for them. But, thanks to her actions tonight, they would not face that danger unprepared. Charlotte pulled a shawl around her shoulders and continued her vigil by the window. She would not sleep tonight, not while she waited to learn whether her warning had reached Captain Voss in time. And she knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new moral choices that would test her courage and her commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. The young princess who had hidden behind library curtains earlier that evening was gone forever. In her place sat a woman who understood the true weight of power and the responsibility that came with knowledge of others' suffering. Charlotte had taken her first step down a path that would lead her far from the comfortable certainty of royal privilege. But she knew in her heart that it was the only path she could choose. As dawn approached, she whispered a prayer for the families in the northern provinces and prepared herself for whatever consequences her actions might bring.